Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about why we can't get rid of weight classes in sports and why size actually does equal strength. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And also, if you guys haven't checked it out, go check out my new Patreon site over my About tab where I cover unique content that I don't always cover here on YouTube. But on to this point, because you get a lot of people who have these ideas about size not equaling strength, but then they'll want to jump into relative strength. And you'll see the same people will say, well, of course you lift more than that guy, you weigh more, but it's not, oh, you have more muscle. Well, no, it is because you have more muscle. Size does actually equal strength. And there's this misconception from the bodybuilding world that it doesn't, and people need to understand that same misconception and delusional idea. We can't apply it to the sports world. We can't, because it won't fly. The research shows that size equals strength in terms of muscle mass. We know that's the case. The only exceptions that happen are people who particularly train and find ways to avoid getting stronger, who really go out of their way to do so. And that usually involves intentionally doing excessive isolation work, intentionally doing really, really high reps, using a lot of drugs, site enhancement, things like that. That's how guys get around it. But it's actually the hardest way to get big is to do all this stuff. It really is more difficult to do it that way, and it's just absurd. But the whole point is that when you go look at any sort of sport, I would say to people who don't believe that size equals strength, well, why don't we just get rid of weight classes? If there's not a large degree of truth to that fact, why do we need weight classes in sports? Why can't the 150-pound boxers box the heavyweights? Why can't the 140-pound MMA guys get in there and in a cage with a 220 or 230-pound guy who has the same body fat and skill level? Well, because they would get destroyed. They would get destroyed. And the reality is, when you find someone who's in any of those sports who actually is capable of beating guys in higher weight classes than them, it's a testament to how skilled they are, because they don't just have to be a little bit better, they have to be a lot better. They have to be a lot better to win. They can't just be slightly better. Right? Their skill level has to be way up here in comparison to pull it off. And I remember the first example I saw of that when I was in high school. I remember this smaller Asian kid got in a fight with a really, really big guy. And I could be exaggerating because maybe I'm misremembering it, but I think this guy was like 6'4", 6'5", at least 300 pounds. No idea if he worked out or not. He wasn't on the football team, nothing like that. I'm pretty sure the dude was just a stoner. But again, he was a big guy. And I remember this kid jumping up and delivering this beautiful roundhouse kick. It was actually pretty impressive, because he caught air, he jumped, kicked him, landed right in the chest. What do you think happened? It didn't do anything, because he didn't weigh enough. He had a body weight that was probably a third of this guy's body weight. He wasn't capable of delivering enough force to knock him down. He jumped up and got to the guy's chest and kicked him, and the guy grabbed his leg and proceeded to beat the crap out of him. I mean, that's just how it happens. And so, people will say this stuff, well, size doesn't always equal strength. Yeah, it actually does. Now, there are exceptions where some people have just very efficient levers, but even in that same person, if they gain muscle, they get stronger. If they lose muscle, they get weaker. All right, that's reality. So when people say things like, well, of course you lift more than this guy, you weigh more. Well, no, that's also because you have more muscle than them. It's not because you weigh more. It's because you have more muscle mass. And the data on that's pretty conclusive. What do we know based upon that squat study that was done this year? Greg Knuckles, Brad Schoenfeld. Brad Schoenfeld's Dr. Bro. He's all about the bodybuilding. He is all about bodybuilding. His PhD is pretty much in bodybuilding. It's his area of expertise. What did they determine? That once they were equalized for height, that the amount of lean body mass you had was directly proportionate to your max squat. Like a max squat to parallel, when they tested it in both men and women. And it wasn't, oh, who had the biggest legs. It was, no, who had the most muscle mass. Because a squat's a full body exercise. Uses your back, uses even your traps. It uses most of the muscles in your body. So therefore, the amount of muscle found through your body is going to determine your max squat when we redistribute it for size, for height. Now, the reality is height is one of the big reasons we have weight classes also. A shorter person can have more muscle in a given weight class. There's a reason you go into elite powerlifting or whatever. Let's use that as an example. There's a reason you don't see tall guys dominating the lighter weight classes. Why? Because too much of their body weight is taken up by bone. In other words, a guy who, say my height, 5'9", we don't do well at 165 in powerlifting. We rarely do well at the 181 in the world level. Occasionally, guys at my height usually need to be 198 or the 220 to be competitive. We just have to, at least at the elite level. What you'll find is that there's definitely a height situation going on. Shorter guys do better in the lighter weight classes because they can have more muscle mass per pound of body weight. There's a reason leaner guys do better in weight classes because, again, if you have less fat, you can have more muscle at the same weight. More muscle equals bigger squat, bigger bench press, right? So the amount of muscle mass that you have is enormously, massively correlated with how strong you are. It's massively correlated. And weight classes show that. And the reason we have weight classes is so that the 140-pound guys don't have to compete against the 220s and the 300s. Because it doesn't matter whether it's lifting weights, doesn't matter whether it's boxing, doesn't matter. Anything that has a competitive strength component against other people, if you do not separate them by weight classes, the biggest guys win. Because size equals strength. The more muscle you have, not only can you squat more, not only can you press more, you can punch harder, you can kick harder, you can grapple harder. Because strength is a product largely of muscle mass. I'm not saying there aren't other variables. We know there are other variables. But the largest one is muscle mass. So there's this myth out there that there's tons of really small, really strong guys, and that's just not the reality. That's not the reality. That maybe they just seem strong oftentimes, and sometimes they are. Sometimes they have some freak leverage advantages so that they get better use of their force for every ounce of muscle they have, that they can produce more due to leverages and things like that for certain lifts, muscle fiber distribution. But that person, their strength also still scales directly to their muscle mass gains. And the reality is the only reason we see this is because you see a lot of guys who maybe really puff up their upper body, certain show muscles, whose overall muscle through their body may not be that high, so they're not that strong. Or they've used lots and lots of drugs specifically to do that without really training those muscles correctly. A perfect example, the guy who does a lot of partial isolation movements, a lot of fluff and pump. That guy, when he uses a lot of drugs, may not gain a lot of strength to go with his muscle mass. He'll gain some. It won't be the same as if a guy had put that same amount of muscle on doing big, heavy movements, though. So that skews those numbers. So people do see some bodybuilders who are particularly weak, but you have to understand that those people are the outliers. When you take people who do not use drugs, you will find 9 out of 10 times, the guy who is the strongest, and by the strongest I don't mean they cheat the weight up, the guy who can pause squat, guy who can pause bench, guy who can pause overhead press off his chest, the strongest guys tend to be the biggest. And not only do we see that in the real world, study after study after study confirms that your strength, even on your 1 rep maxes, the most important factor tends to be how much muscle you have on your frame relative to your height. The biggest factor. There are others behind it, but that one matters the most. And so again, if it wasn't true, and it's what we know, every coach in the world knows this, every researcher in exercise science knows this, but it seems like the bros don't know this. And so if we used the bro logic that's observed in the bodybuilding world, we could just get rid of weight classes in sports. But the reality is we can't, because it would give the guys with more muscle the advantage. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.